Hey everybody, this is a review essay by Peter Beilharz. It's titled The Decline of Western Marxism, Trotsky, Gramsci, Althusser. It's a review of Ian Thatcher's Trotsky, published with Routledge in 2003, Kate Crean's Gramsci, Culture and Anthropology, published with Pluto in 2002, Warren Montag's Louis Althusser, published with Palgrave Macmillan in 2003. So here we go. Just as a start for a reference point, what Wikipedia has to say real quick about Western Marxism. Western Marxism is a current of Marxist theory that arose from Western and Central Europe in the aftermath of the 1917 October Revolution in Russia and the ascent of Leninism. The term denotes a loose collection of theorists who advanced an interpretation of Marxism distinct from classical and orthodox Marxism and the Marxism-Leninism of the Soviet Union. Less concerned with economic analysis than earlier schools of Marxist thought, Western Marxism placed greater emphasis on the study of the cultural trends of capitalist society, deploying the more philosophical and subjective aspects of Marxism, and incorporating non-Marxist approaches to investigating culture and historical development. An important theme was the origin of Karl Marx's thought and the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and the recovery of what they called the, quote, young Marx, end quote, the more humanistic early works of Marx. While some early Western Marxists were prominent political activists, Western Marxism became predominantly the reserve of university-based philosophers. Since the 1960s, the concept has been closely associated with the New Left. Many Western Marxists were adherents of Marxist humanism, but the term also encompasses figures and schools of thought that were strongly critical of Hegelianism and humanism. And then I'll just read through the list of people that Wikipedia says are affiliated with Western Marxism, and obviously this list can be debated depending on what you think Western Marxism is. Louis Althusser, Kostas Axelos, François Châtelet, Jean Devignon, Joseph Gabel, Henri Lefebvre, Edgar Morin, Walter Benjamin, Daniel Ben Said, Marshall Berman, Ernst Bloch, Bertolt Brecht, Lucio Coletti, Galvano della Volpe, the Frankfurt School, so Adorno, Fromm, Habermas, Horkheimer, Löwenthal, Marcuse, Neumann, Pollack, Schmidt, Lucien Goldman, André Gortz, Antonio Gramsci, Frank Jakubowski, Frederick Jameson, Alexander Kojève, Leo Koffler, Karl Korsch, Georg Lukács, Maurice Morlu-Ponty, Antonio Negri, Perry Anderson, George Politzer, I don't know, Moïse Pastone, Nikos Palantzas, Wilhelm Reich, Jean-Paul Sartre, Socialissimo Barbery, including Cornelius Castoriadis, Claude Lefort, Guy Debord, Alfred Zone Reitel, Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez. So yeah, that's something for us to start with. Western Marxism, this is the text now. Western Marxism has long been in decline. Today, even its referent is less than evident. Western Marxism, typically associated with Gramsci, Lukács, and Korsch, arose at that moment that Bolshevism abducted the Marxian legacy. Marxism, in period language, went east, where the structures of civil society were gelatinous and the state primordial. These days we speak rather of North and South, and there is indeed a good case to make that Gramsci was a Southern Marxist. The Eastern frame of reference should still matter, not least as the original orienting device and home of the most interesting thinkers of critical theory, such as Bauman and Heller. Trotsky, in contrast, was a Northerner, even though his influence often went south, as did Althusser's, to Latin America. In the last two cases, however, this was a Jacobin appropriation of Bolshevism. Trotsky and Althusser traveled as Marxist-Leninists. Gramsci alone added something more substantial. In his essay on the Southern Question, he started in the South and stayed there, even in Turin. Marxism today more generally is in decline, globally, North and South. The best symptom of this is the bizarre reception of that bizarre book, Hardt and Negri's Empire. It is one thing that empire solves the crisis of Marxism by turning it into magic again, the magic and fantasy of socialism, communism ever working away within the heart of capitalist globalization. Various thinkers, rather following Weber, have called for the re-enchantment of the world. Here we have the re-enchantment of Marxism via Disney. The Sorcerer's Apprentice turns out, indeed, in this depiction, to be Mickey Mouse. It is another thing, however, to see middle-class radicals lapping all this up. From the comfort of their armchairs, where they can readily empathize with Cecil B. DeMille images of the multitude stirring against or within the heart of capital C capital. All this is likely to make the old Western Marxism look respectable. Thinkers like Trotsky and Althusser had their illusions, or delusions, whether of grandeur or defeat. Gramsci, whose thinking travels best of these three across time and place, has nevertheless suffered more, perhaps for being dressed as the man for all seasons. These three books revisit these Marxist masters of our time, or of the time that has just now passed. Trotsky and Gramsci, of course, inhabit lost worlds, but their appropriation in the English language accelerated into the 70s. This is also the moment of Louis Althusser, although Althusser's presence is more peculiar, heightened to the extent of absolute dominance in England and Australia and then gone, disparu, like the flame that expands dramatically just as it is about to disappear. Trotsky, in the meantime, is also gone, though his spirit lives on in the antechambers of journals like New Left Review. And Gramsci still hangs around, as an Englishman, though the course of the Birmingham School should make this presence more spectral. Gramsci's thinking is plainly still in use, in some version or another. Trotsky has all but disappeared together with the eclipse of his object, the Soviet Union, and Althusser remains an absent presence, apparent in some of the more arcane versions of post-Marxism, otherwise, like structuralism, treated as Atlantis. Probably Althusser, of all these, most deserves a thorough rethinking and reassessment. Perhaps the time for this is ripe. We shall have to wait. Ian Thatcher's Trotsky is the most conventional of these studies. It appears in the Routledge Historical Biographies series, and is the most conspicuously trade-oriented of these books. The studies of Gramsci and Althusser are also presented as introductions, but of different kinds. Thatcher's pitch is straightforwardly historical. Crahan's Gramsci is explicitly aimed at anthropologists, who have hitherto taken their Gramsci half-baked from the pages of Raymond Williams' Marxism and Literature, while Montag's Althusser has become a literary theorist too. Thatcher's Trotsky is a good and useful book, though it tries to have it both ways, being presented both as a way in for the newcomers and as a replacement for Kenai Paz's magisterial 1978 text, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. Frankly, I do not think that the Kenai Paz book will ever be replaced, whatever its limits. The Kenai Paz book is frontal, theoretical, and sophisticated. Thatcher's approach is more directly historical, contextual, and introductory. Thatcher wants to revisit Trotsky without passion, which is undoubtedly what Trotsky generally generates. At the end of all of it, one wonders, Trotsky without passion? Thatcher's approach utilizes his language skills in Russian. Early Western views of Trotsky, for example, are set against the early Russian and Soviet reception. Among the English language works, Thatcher offers applause for Max Eastman and indicates the usual cautionary note about the incredibly influential work of Isaac Deutscher. Max Eastman was the first to write a book. At least I did a historiography for a Soviet history class about the reception of the historiography of secondary Trotsky literature, and I came up with like 60-some books that have been written about Trotsky that they're either written in English or translated into English, and the first one on that list was a book by Max Eastman from like very early, like 1926. So before Trotsky was kicked out of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and before he was exiled. I think he was kicked out of the Communist Party in 1927 and exiled initially to Kazakhstan and then later to Turkey. in 1929. So, Kneipaz's work is criticized in terms more implicit and methodological or disciplinary rather than explicit. Quote, Kneipaz made several errors of judgment in how he conceived his study, end quote. Is it possible that Kneipaz simply had a different approach? Thatcher's implicit appeal is to the common sense historicism of English-speaking culture. In order to understand something, you need to know where it came from. At the end of the day, this common sense may also result in good sense, but this sensibility should not be allowed to preclude the possibility of other ways of seeing or thinking. The ultimate question is, what does the new book add? Thatcher's narrative is clear and insightful, if compromised by its dull purposes of introduction and innovation. Do we need to be told that Trotsky in 1905 wrote, quote, from a Marxist perspective, end quote, or that the, quote, people, end quote, means ordinary workers and peasants? Thatcher's story is nevertheless well told, and what a saga it is, from libertarian anti-Jacobin in 1904 to dictatorial war communism by 1920. It's a very snappy summation of Trotsky's political trajectory. There's a very famous piece, I'm not sure, I haven't read it myself, so I'm talking out my ass a little bit, but there's a famous piece by Trotsky that's a critique of Leninism from like 1904 or something like that called like Our Political Task. It's a very important text in the biography of Leon Trotsky. Whether or not he makes a big deal out of it, it does show a change of political direction. Anyway, Thatcher's story is nevertheless well told, and what a saga it is. From libertarian anti-Jacobin in 1904 to dictatorial war communism by 1920, the libertarian common sense was that the revolution was betrayed not by Stalin in 1936, but by Lenin and Trotsky in 1921. Trotsky whistles while Stalin organizes. Trotsky is expelled, then finally murdered in 1940, leaving abundant material for Hollywood movies and considerable grounds to suggest that, were he to have lived, he may have shifted out of Bolshevism altogether. By the moment of those last debates and the writing of the USSR in War, which is on this channel, Trotsky had opened the in-principle possibility that the USSR might be a new form of totalitarian regime. This was a significant shift of emphasis from the analysis in The Revolution Betrayed of 1936, a book which remains both deeply flawed and yet an astonishing contribution to the sociology of Soviet-type societies. Thatcher informs that the, quote, system described by The Revolution Betrayed was clearly not socialist, end quote, but transitional, opening a line of argument subsequently occupied by thinkers like Ernest Mandel for decades. Yet the political language of this position was also defensist. The USSR was a workers' state, however deformed or degenerated. Practically, the USSR had to be socialist because of the USSR's origin. Thatcher's assessment of Trotsky seems to me, finally, to miss something of the nature of this project. Thatcher criticizes Trotsky for failing to provide any guarantees that the USSR would have been richer or more democratic under his own guidance. Guarantees of any kind seem less than pertinent here. If Trotsky had maintained his early democratic credentials, he too would have been swept aside by Bolshevism only 20 years earlier. Then, in Thatcher's final judgment, quote, it is doubtful whether Trotsky made any lasting contribution to Marxist thought, end quote. My own early study of Trotskyism and the transition to socialism of 1987 was criticized inter alia for its unremittingly negative and critical response to these phenomena. That book is on this channel. I don't know if all of the videos have been released yet, but they're they're set up to. I think by the time this video comes out, it'll definitely be up. But at this point, even I have to come to Comrade Trotsky's defense. In retrospect, there are at least 4 aspects of Trotsky's Marxism that count as major contributions. 2 are early: the emancipatory critique of Bolshevism as Jacobinism in Our Political Tasks of 1904. See, I know what I'm talking about. And the work of historical sociology gathered in the essays on 1905. One spans the distinction between Trotsky before and after his Bolshevik term, the theory of permanent revolution, which, however flawed, looks original enough to me. The last aspect includes The Revolution Betrayed, a pioneering, if ultimately mistaken work, comprised by Trotsky's own personal investment in the object of his analysis. Compromised by Trotsky's own personal investment in the object of his analysis. Other contributions could also be identified, as in the work of R.B. Day on Trotsky's political economy, or more generally, in the signal importance of the ideas of uneven development. Trotsky's legacy emerges from Thatcher's study as negligible, even though it is historically central to the path of the 20th century. The limit of this view seems to me to reflect its disinterest in what followed, not least in the radical Trotskyist stream of the French movement that led to socialism ou barbarie. If it is a considerable source of strength that Thatcher draws on in his deployment of Russian language materials, what is striking here is the absence of the French reception. The single most significant biographical absence here concerns not Castoriadis or Lefort, but the dedicated journal Cahiers, I don't know, let's see how to say that. I don't know why I don't always look things up when it's so easy to just do so.
Cahiers Léon Trotsky.
Cahiers? Is that how you say it?
Cahiers. Cahiers.
Cahiers. Cahiers.
Cahiers.
Cahiers.
Cahiers. Cahiers. Cahiers.
Cahiers. I don't know how the fuck what the hell I'm saying. Cahiers Léon Trotsky. Now more than 20 years old. Enter Gramsci. Kate Crehan, Crehan, C-R-E-H-A-N, let's see who she is. Looks like Kate Crehan earned a PhD in 1986. And is the assistant professor of political economy, gender development, South Africa. Or I don't know. Kate Crehan has conducted extensive work in Zambia. Crehan has also carried out field work in Britain. Among the issues Kate Crehan works on are gender, social differentiation, and quote development. Running through Kate Crehan's work is a concern with the issue of power and the ways in which it is materially and discursively grounded. Crehan has recently published a book on Gramsci and anthropology. Her recent publications include, this might be an old thing, the most recent piece is from 2002, but it says 2002 Gramsci, Culture and Anthropology, published in 2002. An essay called The Rules of the Game, The Political Location of Women in Northwestern Zambia from 1999. 1998, A Vague Passion for a Vague Proletarian Culture, An Anthropologist Reads Gramsci. And 1997, as a book, The Fractured Community, Landscapes of Power and Gender in Rural Zambia. And 1997, an essay titled Of Chickens and Guinea Fowl, Living Matrilineally in Northwestern Zambia in the 1980s. And that's from a journal called Critique of Anthropology. So that's who Kate Crehan is. Crehan. It looks like she has her most recent book, it says, is Community Art and Anthropological Perspective, published in 2011. All right. So back to Gramsci. Kate Crehan's book is one of the best recently published in its field. Its purpose is also dual, to essay Gramsci and to address anthropologists as specific users of Gramsci. The connecting term, obviously, is culture. This is a volume in a new series, Reading Gramsci, edited by Joseph Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg's dad. That's funny. I don't know when this essay is. I didn't look that up. Joseph Buttigieg was a Maltese-American Marxist literary scholar and translator. He served as William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of English at the University of Notre Dame until his retirement in 2017 when he was named Professor Emeritus. Buttigieg also co-translated and co-edited the 3-volume English edition of Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. It's so funny. This is a volume in a new series reading Gramsci by Joseph Buttigieg, who is editor of the Columbia translation of the Garetana edition of the Prison Notebooks. The project, which will eventually replace the 1917 Hoare and Noel Smith standard one volume edition of selections from the Prison Notebooks. I think that's Quentin Hoare, and I'm not sure who Noel Smith's first name is. I'm not an expert on Gramsci, so I'm going to read a little Wikipedia on the Prison Notebooks. The Prison Notebooks are a series of essays written by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was imprisoned by the Italian fascist regime in 1926. The notebooks were written between 1929 and 1935, when Gramsci was released from prison to a medical center on the grounds of ill health. His friend, Piero Sraffa, had supplied the writing implements and notebooks. Gramsci died in April 1937. I didn't know Sraffa and Gramsci knew each other. Gramsci wrote more than 30 notebooks and 3,000 pages of history and analysis during his imprisonment. Although written unsystematically, the prison notebooks are considered a highly original contribution to 20th century political theory. Gramsci drew insights from the varying sources, not only other Marxists, but also thinkers such as Niccolò Machiavelli, Vilfredo Pareto, Georges Sorel, Benedetto Croce. Gramsci's notebooks cover a wide range of topics, including Italian history and nationalism, the French Revolution, fascism, Taylorism and Fordism, civil society, folklore, religion, and high and popular culture. The notebooks are smuggled out of the prison in the 1930s. The first edition was published in 1947 and won the Viareggio Prize a few months later. Gramsci's posthumous award of the Viareggio Prize was followed by a memorial from the Constituent Assembly of Italy on the 28th of April 1947. The first translation into English was printed in the 1970s by the Scottish poet and folklorist Hamish Henderson. Ideas in Marxist theory, critical theory, and educational theory that are associated with Gramsci's name include cultural hegemony as a means of maintaining the capitalist state, the need for popular workers' education to encourage development of intellectuals from the working class, the distinction between political society, the police, the army, legal system, etc., which dominates directly and coercively, and civil society, the family, the education system, trade unions, etc., where leadership is constituted through ideology or by means of consent. The concept of absolute historicism, a critique of economic determinism that opposes fatalistic interpretations of Marxism, a critique of philosophical materialism. Back to the text. Both Buttigieg and Crahan, I can't pronounce this person's name. I can't pronounce either of these names. Deserve congratulations for all their labors, even if Buttigieg is in the series' introduction repeats the standard view of English language Gramsci studies, which screens the Antipodean version out. What the hell does Antipodean mean? I guess that's Australian. Antipodean does it mean? It says, relating to Australia or New Zealand. A person from Australia or New Zealand. Didn't know that. Learn something new every day. It says, Lewis, and back to the text. Louis Marx and Gwyn Williams started Gramsci studies moving in 1957. In 1960, Alistair Davidson translated Gramsci in Australia in 1968, and Antonio Gramsci, the man, his ideas 3 years before Hoare and Noel Smith, generated their more comprehensive version. Let's see who some of these people are. Don't really see anything about Louis Marx. Gwyn Williams has very early pieces. There's a piece on Gramsci from 1960, titled and a book titled "Proletarian Order: Antonio Gramsci, Factory Councils, and the Origins of Italian Communism, 1911 to 1921." Looks like it's from 1975. Looks like Alistair Davidson was an Australian, received a PhD in 1966 from the Australian National University and is Professor Emeritus in Politics at Monash University. He has spent much of his life in Italy and explored the Sardinian background in some detail, as well as research at the Gramsci Institute in Rome. Alistair Davidson is the author of 20 books and hundreds of articles, including The Theory and Practice of Italian Communism, published with Merlin Press in 1982. With Steve Wright, he edited Never Give In, The Italian Resistance and Politics in 1998. Steve Wright, if you don't know, Steve Wright wrote like the main books on autonomism. I actually have a piece, type is called like Mapping the History of Italian Workerism or Autonomism or something related title on this channel. With Steve Wright, he wrote, quote, Never Give In, end quote, The Italian Resistance and Politics, 1998, Immutable Laws of Mankind, The Struggle for Universal Human Rights in 2012, Migration in the Age of Genocide, Law, Forgiveness, and Revenge, 2015. It looks like he wrote an intellectual biography that's available with Haymarket. And the description for that book says, few revolutionaries have a heritage so contested by rival groups as Antonio Gramsci. Many use his writings as sacred texts for their own policies, while others stress any difference with Lenin in order to prove Gramsci a rebel. In this stirring biography, Davidson cuts through these sterile debates and instead focuses on Gramsci's own political and philosophical ideas. Okay, so we looked up Louis Marx, Gwyn Davidson, Alistair Davidson. Guess I should look up Noel Smith as well. It looks like it's a Jeffrey Noel Smith. The internet tells me that Jeffrey Noel Smith is Professor and Senior Research Fellow at Queen Mary University, London, where he is directing a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council on the history of the British Film Institute. He's the editor of the Oxford History of World Cinema, 1996, and has published many books and articles on Italian cinema, most recently Lucina Visconti, 2003. So, looks like he's an Italian guy. Looks like, it says, the Haymarket website says, Jeffrey Noel Smith is Honorary Professor Fellow at Queen's Mary University of London. He was co-translator and co-editor with Quentin Hoare of Antonio Gramsci's Selections from Prison Notebooks, published with Lawrence Wishart, International Publishers, 1971. Jeffrey Noel Smith is editor of the Oxford History of World Cinema, and his most recent book is Making Waves, New Cinemas in the 1960s, published in 2008. The book he has with Haymarket is the book he edited of the selection of cultural writings of Antonio Gramsci. Okay, so looked enough a bunch of shit up there. Might have to look up more. Even within the prison of the English language, this is back to the text, even within the prison of the English language, we in the antipods were reading Gramsci into the late 60s before the Gramsci boom. This is of some importance to us who started Thesis 11 in 1980 because Alistair Davidson, was our teacher. His contribution has never fully been recognized, not even with the publication of his major book, Antonio Gramsci Towards an Intellectual Biography in 1977. That's the book that Haymarket has republished, so, yeah. Buttigieg's series introduction indicates that Crahan's is to be one of many studies, each to take up an aspect or tangent of the Sardinian's work. This is a wonderful prospect. Crahan's book bodes well for what is to follow. The opening cue, however, is unnecessarily positional, what Australians have been known to call pissing on the gatepost, as in the canine marking turf. Quote, as Michel Foucault noted in a 1984 letter to the Gramsci scholar Joseph Buttigieg, Gramsci remains an author who is cited more often than he is genuinely known, end quote. So, what else is new? Genuflection is Paris performed. The argument begins. Crahan, that's what I'm going with now, Crahan, uses a kind of compensatory documentary approach strong on both argument and on a quotation for those who are new to Gramsci or who drop his name without opening his text. Like Thatcher, Crahan begins with biography but then goes elsewhere. Gramsci, of course, was a historicist. It was for this reason that he wrote that the experience on which Marxism was based could not be schematized. It is history in all its infinite variety and multiplicity. Gramsci's work was like that of the early Trotsky, but where Trotsky succumbs to teleology and the logic of necessity, and this is what makes Deutscher his most significant follower, Gramsci stays with the idea of contingency. It is this sense of contingency, incidentally, which explains Gramsci's sense that he should in prison write something for eternity, für ewig. Crahan worries over this idea. It seems to me that if Gramsci understood one thing while he was in prison, it was his own contingency. This was precisely the right time to write für ewig. Crahan is correct, however, to worry over the status of Gramsci's writings. All too often enthusiasts treat the prison notebooks as though they are a theory. This is why the Gratana-Buttigieg project is so important. You have to see the notebooks as notebooks, in extenso. Crahan uses a simple semantic device to push this sense. Instead of quoting Gramsci and then referring to this, quote, theory, or even this, quote, passage, Crahan says, quote, in this note, end quote. The point is not only that the notes are disaggregated, but also that the situation parallels Marx's, the most important texts. Gramsci's notes and letters, as in the Paris manuscripts, the German ideology, and the Grundrisse, were never intended for publication. Gramsci names problems, like hegemony. Gramsci does not resolve them. One result is that enthusiasts identify hegemony and ideology. The even bigger problem for Crahan is culture. Anthropologists work with three common assumptions regarding culture. First, cultures are systems. Second, cultures are discrete and bounded. Third, the societies which come under study are conceptualized in terms of a hard dichotomy between tradition and modernity. Crahan argues that the common anthropological practice is to project these meanings onto Gramsci. A useful discussion on culture, civilization, romanticism, and nationalism follows. None of these anthropological assumptions are shared by Gramsci. Cultures are mobile, contested, internally fissured not least between oppressors and oppressed, and mixed modernity and tradition. Gramsci is less interested in the anthropological disciplinary complex than in relations, and how these create shifting social forms. Crahan rejects the standard image of culture as mosaic and keeps the image of hybridity at a distance. I find all this persuasive. As Nicholas Thomas puts it, hybridity is almost a good idea, but not quite. Who is Nicholas Thomas? Nicholas Thomas was an anthropologist, an Australian-born anthropologist, professor of historical anthropology and director, Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, University of Cambridge since 2006, and fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge since 2007. His selected publications include Islanders, The Pacific in the Age of Empire, 2010, Raru, Waitere, Maori Carving, Colonial History, 2008, Hiapo, Past and Present in Niuean Barcloth, 2005, with John Poole, Discoveries, The Voyage of Captain James Cook, 2003, Possessions, Indigenous Art/Colonial Culture, 1999, Oceanic Art, World of Art, 1995, Entangled Objects, 1991. Back to the text. I find all this persuasive. As Nicholas Thomas put it, hybridity is almost a good idea, but not quite. What works better because it is more persuasively mobile and yet can register asymmetries of power without taking on the unhappy biologistic connotations of the hybrid is the idea of cultural traffic. Wikipedia says hybridity is, in its most basic sense, refers to mixture. The term originates from biology and was consequently employed in linguistics and in racial theory in the 19th century. Hybridity's contemporary uses are scattered across numerous academic disciplines and is salient in popular culture. Hybridity is used in discourses about race, post-colonialism, identity, anti-racism, and multiculturalism and globalization, developed from its roots as a biological term. Let's see if there's anything for cultural traffic. Not seeing anything explicitly for the concept cultural traffic. So next Crahan turns to Gramsci's views to establish and clarify the difference. Crahan does not make the connection to Castoriadis or to Heller here, but the implication of a reading of Gramsci is that culture facilitates autonomy. Culture involves for Gramsci the exercise of thought, the acquisition of general ideas, like cause and effect. It is Socratic. It means thinking well, whatever one thinks, and therefore acting well, whatever one does. Culture is organization, self-discipline, coming to terms with one's own personality, rights and obligations. One can imagine Gramsci saying that culture is history, history is contingency. Yet Gramsci was also an orthodox Marxist, at least inasmuch as he saw classes as the primary actors, even when classes are refracted through images like subalternality. Wikipedia says, subaltern. In post-colonial studies and critical theory, subalterns are the colonial populations who are socially, politically, and geographically excluded from the hierarchy of power of an imperial colony and from the metropolitan homeland of an empire. Antonio Gramsci coined the term subaltern to identify the cultural hegemony that excludes and displaces specific people and social groups from the socioeconomic institutions of society in order to deny their agency and voices in colonial politics. The terms subaltern and subaltern studies entered the vocabulary of post-colonial studies through the works of the Subaltern Studies Group of historians who explored the political actor role of the common people who constitute the mass population, rather than re-explore the political actor roles of the social and economic elites in the history of India. As a method of investigation and analysis of the political role of subaltern populations, Karl Marx's theory of history presents colonial history from the perspective of the proletariat, that the who and the what of social class are determined by the economic relations among the social classes of society. Since the 1970s, the term subaltern has denoted the colonized peoples of the Indian subcontinent, imperial history told from below, from the perspective of the colonized peoples, rather than from the perspective of the colonizers from Western Europe. By the 1980s, the subaltern studies method of historical inquiry was applied to South Asian historiography. As a method of intellectual discourse, the concept of the subaltern originated as a Eurocentric method of historical inquiry for the study of non-Western peoples, of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and their relation to Western Europe as the center of world history. Subaltern studies became the model for historical research of the subaltern's experience of colonialism in the Indian subcontinent. Back to the text. Yet Gramsci was also an orthodox Marxist, at least inasmuch as he saw classes as the primary actors, even when classes are refracted through images like subalternality. Crahan finds this attractive. Maybe class analysis these days is of more potential use in anthropology than in sociology, given the blurring effect that consumerism has on class relations in the West, or North. But Gramsci also talks of social groups, and it is not obvious that he views classes as empirical actors. Classes have empirical representatives, but classes are precisely organizations, institutions, and not classes themselves. Classes only, quote, act indirectly, if at all, via unions, parties, papers, movements. If we read Gramsci as a movement theorist rather than a class analyst, then the problems of Bolshevism, Jacobinism, and the New Prince begin to free up. For there must surely be parts of Gramsci's legacy that we do not want, no matter how superior the logic of his claims might appear over and against those of anthropology. The striking absence from Crahan's text here, unless I have missed it, is Gramsci's idea of the historic bloc. Damn it. Wikipedia says Gramsci calls this union of social forces a historic. Sorry, I'll read the whole paragraph that's from. It's like a highlighted excerpt. To counter the notion that bourgeois values represented natural or normal values for society, the working class needed to develop a culture of its own. While Lenin held that culture was ancillary to political objectives, Gramsci saw culture as fundamental to the attainment of power and that cultural hegemony be achieved first. In Gramsci's view, a class cannot dominate in modern conditions by merely advancing its own narrow economic interests, and neither can it dominate purely through force and coercion. Rather, it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises with a variety of forces. Gramsci calls this union of social forces a historic bloc, taking the term from George Sorel. This bloc forms the basis of consent to a certain social order, which produces and reproduces the hegemony of the dominant class through a nexus of institutions, social relations, and ideas. In this way, Gramsci's theory emphasizes the importance of the political and ideological superstructure in both maintaining and fracturing relations of the economic base. So, back to the text. The striking absence from Crahan's text here, unless I have missed it, is Gramsci's idea of the historic bloc. Crahan observes, for example, that hegemony belongs to a class, or an alliance of classes. My recollection, not least in connection with the period debate over Thatcherism in New Left Review, is that the more powerful case is that hegemony is constructed via the historic block of interests that held together Thatcherism then, or Blairism now. If classes do act, classes certainly do not act singly, only in concert, via the political forms available to them. Crahan's concern is that the key relationship is between dominators and dominated, not between the traditional and the modern. But again, when it comes to hegemony as mediated via the historic block, any firm distinction between tradition and modernity will fail to capture the invention of tradition, as Crahan later argues. The notion of subalternality, of course, evokes the influence of the subaltern studies group. Let's look up the subaltern studies group. Wikipedia says, the Subaltern Studies Group, or Subaltern Studies Collective, is a group of South Asian scholars interested in post-colonial and post-imperial societies. The term subaltern studies is sometimes also applied more broadly to others who share many of their views, and they are often considered to be, quote, exemplary of post-colonial studies, end quote, and as one of the most influential movements in the field. Their anti-essentialist approach is one of history from below, focused more on what happens among the masses at the base levels of society than among the elite. These are some of the people that are associated with it. I'm going to fuck up all their names, I'm sure. David Arnold, Gautam Bhadra, Dipesh Chakrabarti, Partha Chatterjee, Ranjit Guha, David Hardiman, Sudipta Kaviraj, Guy Indra Pandi, Gyan Prakash, Sarojini Sahu, Sumit Sarkar, later dissented, Ajay Skaria, Gajatri Chakravorty, Spivak, Eric Stokes, Susie Thero, Engin Sustum. Back to the text. As Crahan argues, however, Gramsci here has a kind of portal, was a kind of portal to Foucault. The associated problem arises that Gramsci's notes on the Italian peasantry are universalized by their users, only to be found wanting. Finally, Crahan brings anthropology and Gramsci more fully together via the work of Raymond Williams. I'm assuming you know who Raymond Williams is. One big problem here is the specificity of the distinct culture wars across the Atlantic. Williams, after all, had a different context, purpose, and field, and different enemies. Crahan worries, in particular, that Gramsci is appropriated thinly by American anthropologists, who seem to have missed out on, or are indifferent towards cultural materialism. Here again, the point is that it is history, rather than culture, which is at issue. This is the point to the old trick question, is a market an economy or a culture? Obviously, it is both, and it is only the work of historical specificity that will clarify what is involved. Categories are can openers, which young academics will nevertheless dedicate their lives to. And this is why all categories, including class, which matters so much to Crahan, need to be used as questions rather than answers. In the lonely moment of the last instance, finally, there arrives Warren Montag. It says that Warren Montag teaches 18th century British and European literature with particular reference to political philosophy. He also teaches 20th century European critical theory. His books include The Other Adam Smith, published in 2014, Philosopher's Perpetual War, Althusser and his Contemporaries, 2013, Louis Althusser, 2003, Bodies, Masses, Power, Spinoza and his Contemporaries, 1999, The Unthinkable Swift, The Spontaneous Philosophy of a Church of England Man. He edited the collections Masses, Classes, and the Public Sphere, 2001, In a Materialist Way, Selected Essays by Pierre Machery, The New Spinoza, published in 1997. I won't read all his essays, but he edits a journal called Decalogue, or Decalogues, a journal of Althusser studies. Anyway, back to the text. In the lonely moment of the last instance, finally, there arrives Warren Montag, together with Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser is a clever, elusive book. Indeed, when I flicked through my review copy, I wondered for a moment if it had been disassembled, for there are very long passages on Heart of Darkness and Robinson Crusoe. Montag's book is the most innovative of the three books under review, though it almost certainly risks losing its introductory readers promptly. It is more of a personal collage, reaching sideways to Machery, Conrad, and Defoe, rather than working centrally through Althusser. Perhaps this is the license of literary theory. It is no longer the case that we all read Althusser, if we ever did. To even evoke the name is to return, for example, to the moment when Thesis 11 was in formation. We were reading Althusser, E.P. Thompson, Poulantzas, less enthusiastically G.A. Cohen, and we were reading Marx's Capital, which by comparison was time well spent. Certainly, Althusser cast his spell, or at least his publicists did. The shortcut to reading Capital was through Ben Brewster's glossary, and the spell was there, as Montag reminds. The care given to the idea of reading by Althusser was enough to capture any young Marxist seeking legitimation for all those hours spent in silent late nights and early mornings reading. But if the anthropologists, according to Crahan, take in their Gramsci from literary theory, here, with Althusser, the literary theory came via political economy. Marx, of course, read Robinson Crusoe, so the circuit is intact. Whether the side trip with Kurtz is essential, or rather just interesting, may well be another matter. I think he's referring to Kurtz as like Conrad's, was it Conrad's Heart of Darkness? That was like the basis for Apocalypse Now. That's who I know Kurtz is. Anyway, Marlon Brando's character in Apocalypse Now, I believe. I might be talking my ass. Althusser sought a scientific approach to knowledge, to history, even to literature, though in this last instance it was Pierre Machery who did the running in A Theory of Literary Production.
Pierre Machery. Pierre Machery.
Pierre Machery. Wikipedia says, Pierre Machery is a French Marxist philosopher and literary critic at the University of L'Île-Nord-de-France. A former student of Louis Althusser and collaborator on the influential volume Reading Capital, Machery is a central figure in the development of French post-structuralism and Marxism. Pierre Macheret's work is influential in literary theory and continental philosophy in Europe, including Britain, though it is generally little read in the United States. His works include The Speculative Subject. Sorry, misread that. The author of an essay titled The Productive Subject, which was published in Viewpoint in 2015. Reading Capital 1965 with Louis Althusser, Etienne Balibar, and Jacques Rancière. Hegel ou Spinoza, 1997. A Theory of Literary Production, Hegel et la Société. The Object of Literature, In a Materialist Way, Selected Essays, Hegel or Spinoza, which I guess was originally from 1977, but only translated in English in 2012. What was I doing? A Theory of Literary Production. I'm looking that up. Pierre Macheret's A Theory of Literary Production. The description says, "Who is more important, the reader or the writer?" Originally published in French in 1966, Pierre Macheret's first and most famous work, A Theory of Literary Production, dared to challenge perceived wisdom and quickly established Pierre Macheret as a pivotal figure in literary theory. The reissue of this work as a Routledge classic brings some radical ideas to a new audience and argues persuasively for a totally new way of reading. As such, it is an essential work for anyone interested in the development of literary theory. Back to the text. Althusser sought a scientific approach to knowledge, to history, even to literature, though in this last instance it was Pierre Macheret who did the running in A Theory of Literary Production. These were the days when production was a master trope. This is the logic of economism rampant, so that even aesthetics need to be viewed as a production. No room for ideas like creation here. Reading Capital faithfully followed Marx's logic. That capitalist production, once understood, would yield the understanding of everything else by extrapolation. I have Louis Althusser's introduction to Reading Capital as well as his piece, The Object of Capital, on this channel. Not all of the videos have been released yet, but they're uploaded. They're just, I don't want to release all the videos on the same day. Reading Capital faithfully followed Marx's logic. That capitalist production, once understood, would yield the understanding of everything else by extrapolation. For all its profundity, as Montag reminds us, we should begin from the fact that Reading Capital is a seminar. The essays in For Marx were more variegated. The idea of overdetermination, borrowed from psychoanalysis. We all read Laplanche and Pontalis, was widely in comparison, identified as a way out of economism. I remember in that period 20 years ago, discovering in separate conversations with Stuart Hall, Ernesto Laclau, and my teacher, Alistair Davidson, that, quote, contradiction and overdetermination, end quote, was all their favorite Althusser text. According to Wikipedia, overdetermination occurs when a single observed effect is determined by multiple causes, any one of which alone would be conceivably sufficient to determine the effect. The term overdetermination was used by Sigmund Freud as a key concept in his psychoanalysis and later by Louis Althusser. In the philosophy of science, the concept of overdetermination has been used to describe a situation in which there are more causes present than are necessary to cause an effect. Overdetermination is here in contrast to underdetermination, where the number or strength of causes is insufficient. I don't know who Laplanche is. It says Jean Laplanche, was a French author who lived from 1924 to 2012. He was a psychoanalyst and winemaker. Laplanche is best known for his work on psychosexual development and Sigmund Freud's seduction theory, and wrote more than a dozen books on psychoanalytic theory. The journal Radical Philosophy describes Jean Laplanche as, quote, the most original and philosophically informed psychoanalytic theorist of his day. From 1988 until his death, Jean Laplanche was the scientific director of the German to French translation of Freud's complete works. Œuvre complète de Freud /psychoanalysis. I don't fucking know. In the presses Universitaire de France, in association with André Bourguignon, Pierre Cotte, and François Robert. So that's Laplanche. And it says, Wikipedia says, Jean Bertrand Pontarlier lived from 1924 to 2013 and was a French philosopher, writer, editor, and psychoanalyst. Back to the text. The emblematic sense corresponding to this in the context of Marx's work was that Marx was better viewed as the author of the 18th Brumaire than of Capital. This logic seems to be quite at odds with that of reading Capital, a text which in places could be so fascinating as to make you wonder whether you were being taken in. The most influential text, however, was very likely Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatus, with its famous inclusion of the idea of interpellation. Excuse me. So interpellation is a concept introduced, according to Wikipedia, interpellation is a concept introduced to Marxist theory by Louis Althusser as the mechanism through which pre-existing social structures, quote, constitute or construct individual human organisms as subjects with consciousness and agency. Althusser asks how people come voluntarily to live within class, gender, racial, or other identities, and argue that this happens through, quote, state apparatuses, end quote, such as the family, mass media, schools, churches, the judicial system, police, government, continually telling individuals what they are from infancy. In this way, apparatuses maintain the social order. In Althusser's view, apparatuses call us, or, quote, hail, end quote, us, French, interpeller, by labels, and we learn to respond to those labels. In this structuralist philosophy, social structures constitute subjects rather than individuals constituting their own subjectivity for themselves. And ideology and ideological state apparatuses, notes towards an investigation, according to Wikipedia, is an essay by the French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser. First published in 1970, it advances Althusser's conception and critique of ideology. Where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels posited a thinly sketched theory of ideology as a system of falsehood serving the ruling class, Althusser draws upon the works of later theorists such as Antonio Gramsci, Sigmund Freud, and Jacques Lacan to proffer a more elaborate redefinition of the theory. Althusser's theory of ideology has remained influential since it was written. And finally, The Future Lasts a Long Time by Louis Althusser. That's what I'm trying to find. According to Amazon, the book description for The Future Lasts a Long Time is titled, it says, in this astonishing revelatory autobiography, Louis Althusser, one of the most influential French thinkers of the 60s and 70s, along with Sartre, Barthes, Foucault, and Lacan, admits to his fears of exposure as an intellectual fraud. He analyzes his fraught, unconventional relationship with his wife Helene and reveals a history of severe identity crisis and mental illness. That's where I'm heading now to, sir. I'll be with you shortly. Back to the text. The most influential text, however, was very likely ideology and ideological state apparatuses, with its famous inclusion of the idea of interpolation. And then there were the later writings, including The Future Lasts a Long Time, which some seem to have read with pathos and others with bewilderment. If there are many Marxes, at least 2 Trotskys and Gramscis, early and late, there are many Althussers. Beilharz captured one distinction with the image that there are 2 kinds of Althusserians, Althusserians of the conjuncture and Althusserians of the structure. Or, we could say differently, there were those who put Althusser's insights to work and those who recited the axioms. Perhaps the problem here is that the more intellectually sophisticated Althusserianism became, the less useful it was. Where the younger Trotsky and Gramsci acted out of humanism or historicism, Althusser discovered that humanism was psychologically untenable. History gave way to structure. Action might at most be construed as production. In the interim, Althusser's work could do nothing positive with Gramsci. Marxism, we were instructed, was not a historicism. Freud and Lacan, and now it seems especially Spinoza, were the real treasures in this Trojan horse construction. As Montag puts it, for Althusser the function of art was not so much, qua socialist realism, to make reality visible as to make visible the myths that govern us. Fetishism was a tolerable trope, but not alienation. Montag takes us through Brecht and Beckett to contemplate this. The outsider might be forgiven for wondering how Beckett, the absurd, escapes what is served up here by Althusser for existentialism. Then Macheret, Foucault, Freud, Spinoza. For Macheret, the artist has no more prospect of autonomy than the proletarian, but both produce. Notwithstanding the scientific distance taken here from Romanticism, Louis Althusser seems to emerge from this text, or from under his own, as a tragic hero. Quote, left to sail in darkened waters, reflected stars scattered around his fragile craft like so many resplendent splinters of shattered glass, end quote. Quote, the whole nothing more than a still motion photograph of innumerable splinters of shattered glass as they descend in divergent arcs, never to reach the ground, end quote. Is collage not detritus or shards or shard? It is collage, not detritus or shard that follows. Montag intelligently maneuvers bits of text and interpretation. He is, after all, reading Althusser. Then Heart of Darkness arrives. This seems to me to be a peculiar gesture, not least in a book of this kind, but also because it risks rerunning the kind of interpretation it sets out to reverse. Wikipedia says, Heart of Darkness from 1899 is a novella by Polish-English novelist Joseph Conrad, in which the sailor Charles Marlowe tells his listeners the story of his assignment as steamer captain for a Belgian company in the African interior. The novel is widely regarded as a critique of European colonial rule in Africa, whilst also examining the themes of power dynamics and morality. Although Conrad does not name the river on which most of the narrative takes place at the time of writing, the Congo Free State, the location of the large and economically important Congo River was a private colony of Belgium's King Leopold II. Marlowe is given a text by Kurtz, an ivory trader working on a trading station far up the river, who has, quote, gone native, and is the object of Marlowe's expedition. Central to Conrad's work is the idea that there is little difference between, quote, civilized people, end quote, and, quote, savages. Heart of Darkness implicitly comments on imperialism and racism. The novella's setting provides the frame for Marlowe's story of his fascination for the prolific ivory trader Kurtz. Conrad draws parallels between London, the greatest town on earth, and Africa as places of darkness. Originally issued as a three-part serial story in Blackwoods magazine to celebrate the 1000th edition of the magazine, Heart of Darkness has been widely republished and translated in many languages. Heart of Darkness provides the inspiration for Francis Ford Coppola's 1979 film Apocalypse Now. In 1998, Modern Library ranked Heart of Darkness 67th on their list of the 100 best novels in English of the 20th century. And Wikipedia says, since he was referenced in the text, Wikipedia says Kurtz is a central fictional character in Joseph Conrad's 1899 novella, Heart of Darkness. A trader of ivory in Africa and commander of a trading post, he monopolizes his position as a demagogue among native Africans. Kurtz meets with the novella's protagonist, Charles Marlowe, who returns him to the coast via steamboat. Kurtz, whose reputation precedes him, impresses Marlowe strongly, and during the return journey, Marlowe is witness to Kurtz's final moments. I think... Never mind. I was about to say... Never mind. Back to the text. Then Heart of Darkness arrives. This seems to me to be a peculiar gesture, not least in a book of this kind, but also because it risks rerunning the kind of interpretation it sets out to reverse. Montag quotes Hochschild in King Leopold's Ghost. Is it Adams Hochschild? I believe King Leopold's Ghost. To say that we should beware universalizing Kurtz, which is always what happens. It's good I looked up Kurtz because he's referenced again. King Leopold's Ghost, A Story of Greed, Terror, and Colonialism. King Leopold's Ghost, A Story of Greed, Terror, and Heroism in Colonial Africa, by Adams Hochschild. And the description for that book says, in the 1880s, as European powers were carving up Africa, King Leopold II of Belgium seized for himself the vast and mostly unexplored territory surrounding the Congo River. Carrying out a genocidal plundering of the Congo, he looted its rubber, brutalized its people, and ultimately slashed its population by 10 million, all the while shrewdly cultivating his reputation as a great humanitarian. Heroic efforts to expose these crimes eventually led to the first great human rights movement of the 20th century, in which everyone from Mark Twain to the Archbishop of Canterbury participated. King Leopold's Ghost is the haunting account of a megalomaniac of monstrous proportions, a man of cunning, charming, and cruel as any one of the great Shakespearean villains. It is also the deeply moving portrait of those who fought Leopold, a brave handful of missionaries, travelers, and young idealists who went to Africa for work or adventure and unexpectedly found themselves witnesses to a Holocaust. Adam Hochschild brings this largely untold story alive with the wit and skill of Barbara Tuchman. Like her, he knows that history often provides a far richer cast of characters than any novelist could invent. Chief among them is Edmund Morel, a young British shipping agent who went on to lead the international crusade against Leopold. Another hero of this tale, the Irish patriot Roger Casement, ended his life on a London gallows. Two courageous black Americans, George Washington Williams and William Shepard, risked much to bring evidence of the Congo atrocities to the outside world. Sailing into the middle of the story was a young Congo River steamboat officer named Joseph Conrad, and looming above them all, the duplicitous billionaire King Leopold II. With great power and compassion, King Leopold's Ghost will brand the tragedy of the Congo too long forgotten onto the conscience of the West. Back to the text. Kurtz is a metaphor for everything. Heart of Darkness is read as a parable for all times and places, not as a book about one time and place. Yet if Marxism is not a historicism, what has this to do with Althusser? Montag's strategy seems to be to do what you could do with Althusser, but which Althusser failed to do. Montag's reading of Conrad is persuasive, except that he plays hard on the internationalism of the international workers' movement, which was also quite gifted at nationalism in the making. The Social Democrats, for example, had read Locke and not only Marx, and some of them thought imperialism was a good idea. Then after 17 pages of Kurt's analysis, Robinson Crusoe arrives in the company of Friday, and here it seems Althusser has found his Monday. 16 pages later, Althusser returns, leaving a single footprint on the sand, leaving this metaphor awaiting Foucault, who hoped rather to be washed away. Montag's exit goes back to the future lasts a long time, and to the question of Althusser's self-deprecating confession. This is powerful prose, not least as it reminds of Althusser's modesty and self-mockery. Here was a man who could claim, in the presence of philosophers, that he knew nothing of philosophy, only a little Marx and Lenin. This was a Marxist who could seek out the problem of the concept of time, and at the same time argue that contingency was another word for the unknown. There is so much that we will never know. The end. Peter Beilharz co-founded Thesis 11 in 1980 with Alistair Davidson and Julian Triado. Sorry, I was reading about Spanish Civil War recently, so I want to read everything with a J with a H sound. Peter Beilharz is author inter alia of Imagining the Antipodes, 1997, and Zygmunt Bauman, Dialectic of Modernity, in 2000. Peter Beilharz is trying to work on a book on the Austrian experience across the 20th century and directs the Thesis 11 Centre for Critical Theory at La Trobe. This piece is from, I think it's from 2003. Thanks for listening. I was going to try to look up Julian Triado, but my internet's not working. Thanks for listening.